Okay. The second part of the British government is, whoops. I did something. And now it's not letting me share. There we go. The second branch of the British government that we care about is Parliament, and you are looking at one of my favorite musical groups of all time, George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic All-Stars. You should listen to them. They're pretty dope. So Parliament is a bicameral legislature. There are two houses, the House of Commons, the lower house, the House of Lords is the upper house. This is the same kind of distinction that we've talked about with the different legislatures in the presidential systems we've looked at in Nigeria and Mexico to this point. So the House of Lords is about 800 members, that it's not necessarily fixed because there are a number of people who will arbitrarily be given representation in the House of Lords. There are a couple of classes of lords who have seats in the House of Lords. The first are life peers. These are individuals who are appointed by the monarch on advice of the prime minister. So one of the things that we talked about is that after 2 years after she was no longer prime minister, Margaret Thatcher was appointed a life peer, meaning that she could serve in the House of Lords until her death. So it allows her to still be a civil servant in some shape or form, but with a little bit less power. Category number 2 are the hereditary peers. These are individuals who have, their families have always had seats in the House of Lords. So if I were a member of the House of Lords and I died or I was no longer able to serve, then I could appoint that or will to the next member of my family who would be able to have that service. There are the Lords Spiritual. These are officials of the Church of England that all have the ability to participate in the House of Lords. And there are also the Lords Temporal, which are lawyers, but the number of those are dwindling. Their role in legislation has consistently kind of changed over time. So just like a second chamber of Congress, they can debate legislation that comes from the House of Commons. They can refine or amend legislation that comes from the House of Commons, and they can delay the passage of legislation that comes from the House of Commons, but they cannot block it. So originally they could block or delay indefinitely measures from the House of Commons from being implemented, but one of the great reforms to weaken the House of Lords and empower the House of Commons limits their delay to no longer than one full legislative calendar year from going into implementation. You have seen a couple of questions pop up with the House of Lords in terms of reform. So these are both good discussion questions for you, but these are also live questions that people have been discussing about the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. First, should the hereditary peers be removed? Should they be phased out? And the second is, should they have elected members instead of appointed and hereditary peers, right? So instead of the Lord Spiritual or the hereditary peers or, you know, the life peers who get appointed, should it become a second branch like a Senate that can have a more deliberative role or a more specialized role in dealing with legislature or acts of parliament than them just kind of being there to offer amendments or block it for a year? The number of different types of peers are kind of going down. This chart is a little out of date, and I forgot to grab the most up-to-date one before now. So the only way that some of the numbers on these life peers will change is if new folks get appointed or if people die. But this will also show you their political leanings. So that's the other area where it becomes difficult for the House of Lords to do anything in its current form as a second house to vet or change legislation. Is there's no way to influence it politically by elections, right? So there are, as of a couple years ago, 225 individuals from either the life or hereditary peers were conservatives, 211 were Labor, 101 were Lib Dems, 20 were non-affiliated, 26 were with the church, and then you had 176 crossbenchers, which were people who would advocate policies or had been part of one or both political parties at some point in their or their family's life. The second and more important chamber of the UK's legislature is the House of Commons. Right, they are the ones who do the bulk of governing, right? The Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the notion of collective responsibility are really what rules the lower house. What is interesting is that the UK has something that is literally called the shadow government, which when we hear that phrase, we tend to think, get out your tinfoil hats, because here comes some hot takes from a deep state conspiracy theorist. But the shadow government, also known as the loyal opposition, is the political organization of the other political parties. So for each, interior secretary or interior minister, there is the shadow minister of the interior or the chancellor of the exchequer. And the job of the shadow ministers is to help understand how to offer counterpoints or counter legislative proposals from the person who sits across the parliament from them. You'll hear people talk about backbenchers when you look at, I think I have an image of Parliament here. So on the left side of Parliament is where the Prime Minister and the party in power sit. On the right side is where the leader of the shadow government or the second largest ranking party sits, and you literally will see them sit across from one another. When we talk about backbenchers, we're looking at people, on 5 or 6 on this chart, that these are people who are not part of the cabinet or the shadow government in any shape or form, right? So these are the lower ranking members of the political party. There's also a Speaker of the House of Commons, but unlike the person who is the Speaker of the House in the United States House of Representatives, where they are not just the one who presides over the House, but they also have the power to set the agenda and things like that, and tend to be driven to support the majority party's wills. The Speaker is a nonpartisan member of Parliament. They literally just keep debate and discussion going. They are the person who gets to decide who speaks during Prime Minister's questions, and that to me is one of my favorite elements of parliamentary systems, let alone the UK's political system. But during the Prime Minister's questions, that they will get to decide who will ask the Prime Minister questions during the bi-weekly nationally televised process. They keep order, so you'll hear the Speaker of the House, when it's getting too unruly, will literally yell order to keep everybody quiet, and then they only get to vote in the case of a tie, which is very unlikely. There are a lot of things in the UK that are still very largely steeped in tradition and the notion of kind of embracing this idea of being the mother democracy. So you can check out this clip that kind of highlights legislative and other kinds of traditions that are still embraced by the UK. But that was mostly there to break up me having to drone on about this in person. In terms of talking about party discipline is very important, where, you're gonna toe the line as a Lib Dem, a member of the Labour Party, a conservative. You're gonna vote in the direction of the party. So since the majority party is the government, seeing them vote in lockstep is very, very common, right? And that's something that is slowly becoming the norm in other political systems around the world, right? That all of the Democrats in the House of Representatives are going to vote together because they're the majority party there. All of the Republicans are going to vote to support Trump because they hold the presidency or the majority party in the Senate. And, if there's a defection, the news media will talk about it at length and go, why was this person thinking what they were thinking? There is more of a norm in the United States or other political non-parliamentary systems around the world to see people break ranks or vote against their party because they have to worry about the interests of their particular legislative district. But since that's not a factor in the UK, the party has to be able to project strength, and anytime they call for a vote on something, you need to be able to see a majority. So there's this expectation that you vote the party line, or it can create a potential tailspin. And when you look at one or two of the short videos that I've shared with you to look at what went down with Brexit, one of the reasons why Theresa May ran into a lot of problems is there were members of her party who did not vote in favor of her Brexit deal or Brexit package, which are reasons why she lost a lot of footing and ultimately had to resign. The other thing that you see is that the majority party wants to avoid losing a vote of no confidence because if there is a large issue that fails, then you have, in theory, you see the cabinet resign immediately, and there are new elections that are held as soon as possible. A confidence vote in the other way is if there's a massive success, the prime minister can call for new elections to try and get more members of the majority party in. So because your political party equals sign government, you have to support everything that happens when it is up for a vote, or your ability to stay within your office becomes problematic. The next little clip in here is something that we'll talk about during office hours. This is a video put together by the Parliament, kind of explaining how a law or a bill becomes an act of Parliament. But really, it's the same kind of I'm just a bill process you can hear talk about in the United States. So there's a first reading where it is read out loud. There's a second reading where there's a debate held in principle about whether or not, Congress should, or the Parliament should act on something. And then it goes to committee, where the committee gets to alter, amend, or examine the act of Parliament. Then they report it out, and then it goes to both chambers of Parliament for a third reading and debate. And then you literally see ping pong, where each house can consider amendments of the other house, and it goes back and forth until they agree. And then once both chambers of Parliament have agreed, then the Queen will give royal assent to make it an act of Parliament. We'll pause here, and then we'll talk about elections again in the last part of the video.